classroom. Hey everyone. So it's 2:59. I am Joe Nowinski. I am glad that you can come join me today. I'm not going to take a super long time doing this, but I wanted to take some time today and break down historically and just take a look at not just our current COVID-19 epidemic, but I wanted to focus on some research I got to do for my time over the summer when I got a chance to go to Europe to study the First World War. And I thought like we can kind of take a look at this in a sequential setup, essentially. So it's going to be more like lecture-y than anything else. But I wanted to just first kind of plug. So first off, I'm just going to throw this in. I already threw it in my comment about it, but this is the information from the Silent Heroes website. So this is National History Day, and if you take a look, right, what's really neat about this is I am just one of a few teachers who have been able to collect these stories from all around the country, right? So and what's cool about this, right, these are all American soldiers who had fought in the First World War, but also the Second World War, right? Korea, Vietnam. This is the Silent Heroes, right? This is what we have as part of our collection. And this is kind of what I did. So let's just start right back at the beginning, right? So this past year, right, I got a chance to be part of this project, right? So these silent heroes are people who died honorably in the First and Second World War, right? And they are everyday people, right? These are people who fought for our country and were a major part of it. But in the end, right, they did not live past their service. So today what I'm going to do is just go back and take a look at my individual who I got to research. And you'll notice that a lot of these individuals had pictures, right? Some of them don't, and mine didn't. So this kind of goes back to what happens when we lose parts of our history. I had a chance to go back and talk to this. I had to go back and a chance and talk to the family members of this person. So this is Sylvester Mushinski, right? So he was a World War I soldier. He was a field operator for these very large artillery units that were on rails, essentially. And so you can kind of see some of the pictures here. And these are actually files that we collected from the National Archives. And one of the things I want to do today is not just take a look at the images that I managed to collect, right? Here's one of my favorite. It's this incredibly large, right, railroad gun. This has got to be 330 millimeters, just massive, right, as part of the cannons. But what I want to do today is just take a look at some of the historical documentation right around the date of the death of Sylvester and kind of relate that back to what we end up seeing with the pandemic, right? So as you guys know, right, we're in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, right, that's going on right now. But this was from Visual Capitalist, and I'll post this too in my comment here, right? This is a look at just the visual history of pandemics over time, right? So when you go back in time, right, the reality is that while COVID-19, I mean, could be a really terrible collection of viruses that could really hit the world, right? Us as a society have had a chance to kind of like clamp that down, tap it down. And that's a really important thing to consider in all this. So if we go back to the files, right, you know, we're really taking a look at essentially what had happened to Sylvester Mushinski, right, when he died, right? So this was one of the documents that I had a chance to look at, and I'll kind of zoom in and show people, right? So this is the war diary of during this time period, right? So this was the 5th of October in 1918. And just so we can kind of put this into context, right? Mushinski was pronounced dead on October 22nd of 1918. And so, hey, Scott, good to see you. And so when he died, right, what had happened was he was part of a group of artillery soldiers, right? So he worked these large guns, right? The 52nd artillery regiment. And this is actually documentation from the time period, right? They have like the weather on the right-hand side. And there's a quick remark, right? So headquarters in Domotine-la-Pochette, right? Batteries on the train at Dompierre-en-Tempel, right? And so these are firing, I don't know how many feet away, you know what I mean? And right, Major W.C. Knight, right? He writes, right, the men that were suffering with slight attacks of la grippe are greatly improved, and most of them are back to duty. No new cases reported. And the problem with this is that, you know, one of the reasons why there is no new cases reported is the army actually took really severe measures to quarantine people who were essentially had the virus, right? So one of the things that happens is soldiers would get sick. It's the flu, right? Literally H1N1. And so what ends up happening is, right, la grippe is literally a French name for the flu or like the disease, right? The grip. And so one of the files that we see, right, and we can actually go back and take a look at a lot of different things here. So this is more documentation from the front lines, right? And these are all the sick and wounded people who were in the war, right? And there you can see a couple things here, right? So this is all sick and wounded are doing well except the following cases, right? And this was from the field hospital that Sylvester was sent to, right? He was sent almost 600 miles away. So I just want to pull up a quick Google map here to give you guys kind of an idea, because I keep kind of putting this into perspective as the war goes on, right? So I'm going to zoom on out here. Let's go to France for a second, right? France, of course, also experiencing a large period of war. So one of the places that we can see, right, is the area of France, right? And the war mostly happened in this region, right? If we're looking at a satellite imagery, right? The lowlands of Europe was really the place this war was fought. Let's just take a look at, right, Dammartine, La Plachette. This place was actually, ooh, hey there. So we'll go to Dammartine, right, in France. So it's all the way up there, right? This is the location of where it's at, right? This little town, Dammartine, right? It's in the northern part of France, essentially next to the city of Amiens, right? And there's another version that, you know, they're a little farther to the east, closer to Reims. But I want you guys just to take a look at something here, right? Dammartine, right? Let's go. Dammartine in France. Here we go. Right there it is. Let's do a quick little directions here. So the field hospital was in a place called Limoges, right? So Limoges in France, right? So essentially what happened was, and you can take a look at the map here, this is how far Sylvester had to travel essentially from when he got sick all the way to when he had to go to the field hospital. This is where the field hospital was, down here in Limoges, right? So literally traveling over, I think it's about, I'll get the directions here. It's about 530 kilometers, so it's like almost 400 miles, right? So it's a pretty crazy distance, right? So, oops, sorry about that. So as we're taking a look at this, right, you know, we talk about the H1N1 pandemic, the Spanish flu, right? One of the things to consider in all of this was that, right, many American soldiers died on the way there. But there's some other interesting things to kind of realize, right, to put this all into perspective. Right. And the first off is that when you take a look at the Spanish flu, the outbreak that happened between 1918 and 1920, right, there's a couple different places where this disease originates. Right. So first off, right, the big thing is just it comes and hits UK and France hard. And well, many people think, well, oh, it initially kind of formed on the front lines, right, human to human contact. But after some research, right, more research has shown that there was a pretty big outbreak in China in about 1917, about a year beforehand, but really no necessary connections, right, between the specific respiratory disease, right? Which, by the way, the flu, it is a respiratory disease, but it hits a lot of other places, right? Body aches, and H1N1 was particularly deadly as well. So, right, kind of once again, we see that China connection, but the reality is that the most likely that the Spanish flu, quote unquote, actually started in the United States. There's in Kansas, right? There was a specific camp where 48 soldiers are going to die in March. And many of those soldiers, right, end up who were at the base who did not die, ended up going to the front lines and fighting in France and the UK. And there's lots of speculation that said, right, the swine flu actually coming from pigs from Midwestern farms in the United States. So it's kind of crazy when you come back and just think about it, right? Once again, I'm looking at Sylvester today, right? Who when this was an American soldier who fought for our arsenal democracy and a real war, right? But this war is tied in directly to this outbreak. And if you're really taking a look at why Spanish flu was so deadly, even compared to COVID-19, right? The current outbreak, right? This tells you the whole story. This is it right here, right? So just like most influenzas, right? People who are under the age of 2, right, see increased death rates, right? People over the age of 65. But the thing about the Spanish flu specifically is this group of people between the ages of 25 and 35 who are dying en masse. And this is the thing, right? It's not just the war, right? This is the same death rate we see in the United States, that we see in France, that we see in the United States, right? It wasn't affected necessarily by the same damage as the war, right? This is the same kind of thing that spreads around the planet, right? In fact, there's lots of pictures if you go take a look, right? And you can kind of see this little map here showcasing where we see the first outbreaks of it, right? Most of it is right here. It's right in the United States. And yeah, right, once again, there is connections to China because, the United States was wanting to trade goods to China, specifically the United States to China at that time period. And from that point on, it just kind of spread around, right? The First World War created sort of this perfect breeding ground for not just a lack of healthcare resources, but like just people living in more squalid conditions. So like when we go back and take a look at the Spanish flu versus COVID-19, right? You've got to really put these things into perspective, right? That the H1N1 pandemic of 1918, right, had all these other fueling factors. And I mean, it doesn't take a lot. Like, so if you go back to, for instance, 1918 pandemic, right, we wonder why, like, oh, why are we closing schools? Why are we doing all these other things? Well, it's pretty straightforward, right? Because if you go and take a look, this was the process that we took back then in regards, right? All these people basically sitting with face masks on, right? Seems kind of familiar, right? Literally the primary sources from the time period, right? These huge, these huge tents filled with people, right? And talk about not having enough beds, right? And the reality was what happened with the pandemic was pretty simple in the sense that like the virus would completely overwhelm your body. And if eventually what would happen is you get fluid that would start to fill up your lungs. And most people didn't actually die of the flu, right? They died because of the complication of pneumonia, right? They literally choke. And what's kind of sad here too, and this has been something I wanted to look at artistically, if you take a look at all these groups, right? You'll notice specifically that, right, here's Sam Mushinski right here. That's his story, right? And he was part of the battery F of it says 42nd here. But what's interesting, right, is if you take a look at some of the other ones, right, there are other people who were in his same battery, right? Battery F of the 52nd Artillery, right? Emil Siegmeyer is one, right? There's another one. Oh, Vincent Kelsey, right? engineer, battery F, right? Possible pneumonia. So like this is something that's interesting. This is a part of the history we don't always talk about, and especially as Americans, right? We always kind of fail to see what was our part in this. And it makes sense because here we were fighting for freedom and democracy in France, right, against the Germans. But it is indeed, right, our soldiers that become not just acutely affected by this, but likely the harbingers. And maybe it's a return, right? When you think about, going back to that model of sorry about that, just kind of clicking around at this point. Going back to the article of the pandemic, just the idea that, like, once again, like, disease is spread simply by people moving around, right? Like, this is all movement. If we put a break on movement forever, right, we lose out. But if we don't do something about the current movement right now, right, that becomes where the real process is, because you literally have to choose who lives and who dies. And in 1918, we simply didn't have the kind of resources we do now. So, if you go back and take a look at the John Hopkins map, I'm sure many people have looked at the map, right, of COVID-19, because I think that's the most interesting aspect of all this, right? But if you take a look at the John Hopkins map, right, it's hard not to take a look at this and be like, oh, I am very alarmed by all of these cases, right? Because it is quite alarming. Like, literally, this number has jumped 20,000 just today around the world. But I also think, like, once again, the problem with the country of Italy and why their deaths are so high, even compared right now to France and UK. Number one, we haven't gotten quite there in the trajectory of the virus in our country. But the reality is, all of these places are simply better off to deal with this. But we can't say that for a guy like Sylvester Mushinski, right? In fact, this is the thing, right? The Mushinski family was for a long time plagued by starvation and disease. So I'll go back to some of the research that I got to do through Ancestry, right? So it's kind of a plug for Ancestry, I guess. But if you go take a look at the census records, right, from the time period, here is the Mushinski family, right? So we have, right, Father Kashmir, right, Sylvester, right, the son, Annie, the wife, right? So Sylvester at this time was 6 years old, right? These are their ages in this column right here, right? Martin 5, Sadie 4, right? Joseph 3, Frank and Lean or Leah, he's a boy. But if you go to 1910 or 1900, right? Now let's go to the Mushinski census in 1910. And what happened was, this was actually the Mushinski family moved from Wisconsin to Chicago, right? Kind of seems weird. We don't normally see that, but you'll notice something interesting here, right? There's at least 2 of these names that are gone. So, like, throughout Sylvester's life, his family had died because of starvation and disease, which is why they moved out of rural Wisconsin and back to the city. And so, once again, just to kind of throw a wrench into all of these weird historical narratives that we might try to form, you can't. It's not easy, right? This is not a simple yes or no and how to do things. And so, just as we're looking at that, right, I want us, as people out there, being thoughtful about what the historical narrative is telling us about this current disease, right? Sylvester's case was, right, he was called up by the army to fight, and he did. But he, once again, like many of the doctors and stuff, right, he made a sacrifice. And the problem is that he died of the thing that he didn't know he was gonna have to die of. So be cautious out there, right? So in the future, right, soldiers and people like Sylvester don't have to worry about disease. I guess maybe that's the takeaway from all this, right? Why does Sylvester Mushinski's story matter today? Well, it tells us a lot about how we fight disease and how we should continue to be better off. All right, so that's yeah, I think I'm gonna stop the sharing there. And yeah, so that's pretty much all I got over here on this end. So I hope that folks found that useful. I hope that it's like a useful thing for people to understand the connection, right, between history and today, and just kind of going back to a personal project. So I hope you folks learned today, the number one, the importance of records and what they can tell us, right, especially military records, census records, but also, putting things in perspective with this disease, right? I think that's really important. There's a reason why we're doing this now, because we didn't do it back then because we couldn't do it as well, and people died, people suffered, and that was just a lot of humanity when we didn't have that. So, while you're sitting at home watching Netflix, just make sure you realize that there's a lot more out there in the world that we have to be super considerate of, and most importantly, what our historical figures went through, right? And then how does that inform us of how we deal with our future? There's a lot of uncertainty because of this, but I think we could be certain that, we need to get through this with a better understanding of how we deal with these things, right? Like, for instance, this is going to happen again. Humanity is going to have to experience this. We are already having to suffer through many struggles. And when I take a look at, for instance, my global studies class, right? So you guys, how does the movement of disease kind of cross with the movement of humans and the movement of ideas, and how do we prevent the spreading of the bad while growing the spread of the good, right? Can social media be a way to do that effectively, or do we run into some of the same problems, right? Just the people taking things places that they don't need to be and then making it a bigger problem. For Law and Order class, right? Think about the way not only that the president has basically signed on to war powers, right? Like, as part of keeping order, right? Is that something that we want to give to a president, right? It's happened before, right? World War II is the best example. But is that a way that we want to go about it? Do we want that sort of strong leadership? I mean, also too, words matter, right? We still call the H1N1 epidemic the Spanish flu, even though Spain had almost nothing to do with it. They were just the first to report it, and then it kind of went from there. Many people called it the Russian flu or the French flu, right? Nobody called it the American flu. And the reality is, the likely spot that the first major outbreak started were in North America, from pigs, that zoonotic disease. People have been talking a lot about bat soup as like a thing, and it's like, yeah, people eat a lot of pork, and it's a really easy reservoir for disease overall. So we don't talk about that, right? We don't say, the American flu, right? That would not fly in our country, right? So does it justify the calling of COVID-19? The president has used the term the Chinese flu, right? Is there a way that, thinking about law and order, right? Should we find better ways to talk about that, to keep order? What does it mean to use our language as a weapon? And on top of that, right, how do you keep order, right? Is our quarantines constitutional? That's a huge question. Does the Constitution give the government, any state and the nation, the ability to say you can't leave your house? right? You can't assemble. That does, you know, where's the constitutionality of the freedom of assembly? That's a big question to think about, you know, as we go into the future, especially as some of you might run into, you know, law enforcement who are like, hey, what are you doing? You don't belong here, right? You know, how do we stand up for our freedoms at the same time, right? Because you're, you know, when we're making ethical decisions about what to do, right? What's better? What's the more ethical decision? Staying in your house, you know, thinking of the greater good, you know, because that's the ethical decision people are putting out there, right? The common good. Think about your elderly, you know, your neighbors, your grandparents, right? Their parents, other people in nursing homes, right? It spreads quickly, you know, it's virtuous to stay at home, or is it, you know, hey, listen, you got to go to work, right? You can't just sit at home and do nothing, right? So get going. Just, you know, just because there might be flu out there, you know, wash your hands and stop being soft, you know. So there's all these different interpretations. Thinking about U.S. history, right? AP U.S. history. Think about how the big issue right now is not that the COVID-19 is causing a world health issue, which it is, right? But the reality is that the economic problem that COVID-19 has basically helped America stumble into. You know, what does that say about the Great Depression, right? How does a contagion like the Great Depression, you know, mirror what's going on now, or vice versa, right? If you look at housing data, right, it was weak, you know, going into this year. People were already calling for recession, right? They were already cutting interest rates. You know, there was already the sign by the Federal Reserve that, oh crap, things aren't going to go well. You know, and after the Great Depression, you know, the Federal Reserve did not respond quickly at all, you know, kind of like, well, we'll see what happens, right? And 3 years later, there's, you know, 22% unemployment in a lot of places and higher in others. So, you know, how should the government respond in an emergency like this, right? And you know, how would you rate President Trump compared to Herbert Hoover, or President Trump to FDR, right? How do those responses, how are they similar and how are they different? Because that's a huge question, right? Regular U.S. history class, right? We're getting into World War I, so, you know, straight up, you know, how does the increase of human interaction, you know, how does it once again create positives and negatives, you know, and what happens when you know where a disease comes from? You know, how should our country respond to a national emergency like a world war or a pandemic? For project history class, right? Just to kind of end it off, right? Project history class, you're working on genealogies, right? What diseases are prevalent in your family? What diseases have affected your family? How is this disease affecting your family? You know, so those are just some big questions as we think about genealogy. Okay, so I'm going to end this session today because, right, we're all going to be done now. But I really want to thank you guys for coming out. I'll say I'm recording this. It's going to go on YouTube. So stop back around for more videos from me. And today we took a look at Sylvester Mushinski, and we kind of looked at his life and what happened, how he died, right? The Spanish flu, and what that meant. And then how does that apply to our class, right? And there's all these questions, right? That's the thing, is like if you're really thinking in this one, you're really thinking about all these questions. How do all these questions really kind of come together? And in the end, right, how are you responding to COVID-19? You know, what does your family say, right? Are you following CDC guidelines, right? Are you saying, well, that's kind of bullhucky, right? Because it wouldn't happen in my neck of the woods, you know? And then you know, reflect on that. Reflect on what you should be doing. Reflect on what you can do. Is there a way you can help? You know, there's lots of people out there who need, like, you know, door-to-door food service. Think about your neighbors, your elderly grandparents, or elderly people in the community. Because if there's a way you can help right now, it's best that you can. This might not be the best way I can help, but it's at least my job. And so I'm going to keep doing my job and doing what I can do best to help help us get through this. So thanks again. Today is the first session, essentially coming out of the first week of spring break for many of my students. So I hope folks find this helpful and useful. So thanks again, and have a good day.